Prepare to unlearn. There is a story you've been told so many times that it no longer sounds like a story. It sounds like a fact, a truth, something obvious, something beyond debate. The story goes like this. Corruption is a problem of poor countries, of unstable democracies, of the global south. It is associated with inefficiency, lack of institutions, weak states, and cultural failure. According to this narrative, rich countries are different. They are transparent, rational, well-governed. When corruption appears there, it is treated as an exception, a scandal, an anomaly, a deviation from the norm. But what if this entire framework is wrong? What if corruption is not smaller in the global north, but simply harder to see, easier to justify, and better protected? If that question already makes you uncomfortable, subscribe to the channel now. Because this space is not designed to confirm what you already believe. It exists to challenge the stories that make global inequality look natural, inevitable, or deserved. Let's slow down and look closer. When people hear the word corruption, very specific images immediately appear. Politicians accepting bribes, suitcases of cash, inflated contracts, public money disappearing through obvious schemes, faces, names, scandals, and almost instinctively, those images point south. Latin America, Africa, South Asia. Rarely do they point toward financial districts in London, New York, Zurich, or Frankfurt. Rarely do they point toward parliaments in wealthy democracies. Rarely do they point toward multinational corporations, banks, or consulting firms. That is not accidental, because in rich countries, corruption rarely uses crude methods. It doesn't need to. It has evolved. It is embedded in laws, protected by institutions, justified by economic language. And most importantly, it is rarely called corruption. In the global north, corruption wears a different costume. It calls itself lobbying. It calls itself fiscal incentives. It calls itself tax planning. It calls itself regulatory expertise. It calls itself competitiveness. The function, however, remains the same, using economic power to influence political decisions in ways that benefit private interests at the expense of the public. Only the vocabulary changes. And vocabulary is power. Because what is not named cannot be condemned. What is normalized cannot be challenged. What is legal is assumed to be legitimate. This is where the first illusion appears. We are taught to believe that legality equals morality, that if something follows the rules, it must be fair, that corruption only exists where laws are broken. But here is the question that rarely enters the conversation. Who writes the rules? If laws are written by those with power, wealth, and access, then legality becomes a shield, not against injustice, but against accountability. This is the core difference between how corruption is framed in the global south and in the global north. In poorer countries, corruption is treated as a moral failure, as individual wrongdoing, as a cultural flaw. Politicians are corrupt. Institutions are weak. Citizens lack civic virtue. In rich countries, corruption is treated as a technical issue, a regulatory problem, a question of efficiency. The system itself is never questioned. If this distinction is starting to make sense, leave a like now. Not as agreement, but as support for discussions that refuse to stay on the surface. Now, let's talk about lobbying. In many northern countries, lobbying is not only legal, it is central to how political systems function. Corporations hire professional lobbyists to influence legislation, regulation, and enforcement. These lobbyists have direct access to lawmakers, ministers, and regulators. They help draft bills. They suggest amendments. They shape entire policy frameworks. All of this happens openly, transparently on paper. But transparency does not mean equality. Who can afford teams of lobbyists? Who can maintain permanent access to political power? Not ordinary citizens, not workers, not marginalized communities. The result is a political system where decision-making is structurally biased toward those with money. This is not corruption as an accident. It is corruption as architecture. Yet it is never described that way, because calling it corruption would force a dangerous question. If corporate influence distorts democracy, then is democracy really functioning? That question is uncomfortable, so the system avoids it. Instead, corruption is exported, conceptually, to the global south. When a politician in a poor country accepts a bribe, it confirms the narrative. When a corporation in a rich country buys influence legally, it disappears into normality. The damage, however, is comparable and often greater. Policies shaped by lobbyists affect millions of people. They influence environmental regulation, labor rights, healthcare access, financial stability, and foreign policy. They decide who pays taxes and who doesn't, who is protected and who is exposed. But because no envelope is exchanged, no one calls it corruption. Another powerful mechanism is the revolving door. People move seamlessly between government and the private sector. A regulator becomes a bank executive. A defense official joins a weapons manufacturer. A former minister sits on the board of a company that benefits from the policies they once promoted. There is no bribe. There is no crime. There is a career path. Decisions made in public office are shaped by future private opportunities. Conflicts of interest are not exceptions, they are incentives. And once again, this is framed as expertise. They understand the system. They bring experience. They improve efficiency. The language cleans the act. If a similar dynamic happened in a poor country, it would be called state capture. In the global north, it is called professionalism. Now let's talk about taxes. Rich countries aggressively compete to attract capital. They lower corporate tax rates, create exemptions, design special regimes for multinational companies, offer secrecy, offer flexibility. When poor countries attempt similar strategies, they are accused of irresponsibility, of undermining public finances, of creating instability. But when rich countries do it, it is framed as smart policy. The result is predictable. Governments collect less revenue. Public services are underfunded. The tax burden shifts onto workers and consumers. This is not an unintended consequence. It is a political choice, and it benefits those already at the top. Nowhere is this more visible than in the global system of tax havens. Trillions of dollars are hidden legally in jurisdictions protected by powerful states. Much of this money originates in the global south, extracted through corruption, unpaid taxes, or resource exploitation. It flows north. It is cleaned. It is protected. Banks, law firms, accounting firms, and governments all play a role. Without the global north, this system could not exist. Yet corruption rankings rarely penalize these countries. Why? Because they measure visible corruption. Bribes, scandals, illegal acts. They ignore legal corruption, influence secrecy and rulemaking. They measure the corruption of the poor and ignore the corruption of the rich. This creates a false moral hierarchy. The South is dysfunctional. The North is exemplary. And that hierarchy is useful. It justifies intervention. It justifies sanctions. It justifies austerity. It justifies control. If corruption is framed as a local moral failure, then global inequality appears deserved. But if corruption is understood as a global system, designed, protected, and managed, then the narrative collapses. And that is precisely what must be avoided. Once you see corruption this way, it becomes impossible to ignore how selectively it is defined. Corruption is not treated as a distortion of public power in favor of private interests. It is treated as a deviation from rules that were never written to be neutral in the first place. This is where corruption becomes geopolitical. Because labeling some countries as corrupt and others as transparent is not just a moral judgment, it is a strategic one. It determines who is trusted, who receives investment, who sets global rules, who is allowed to lecture others. Countries in the global north dominate international institutions that define what corruption is and how it is measured. They design the indicators, they fund the reports, they control the narrative. And unsurprisingly, those indicators focus on what is visible, crude and illegal. Bribes, petty corruption, public scandals. They do not measure regulatory capture. They do not measure lobbying power. They do not measure financial secrecy. They do not measure who writes the rules. This selective measurement produces predictable results. Countries with sophisticated, legalized systems of influence appear clean. Countries with visible, informal corruption appear dirty. The ranking then becomes a weapon. High-ranked countries gain credibility, lower borrowing costs, and political authority. Low-ranked countries face suspicion, higher interest rates, conditional loans, and external pressure. Corruption becomes a justification for inequality, and this logic is constantly reinforced through media, academia, and policy discourse. When corruption scandals happen in the global south, they are framed as proof of systemic failure. When similar dynamics appear in the global north, they are framed as isolated incidents, personal mistakes, or regulatory oversights. The system itself is never put on trial. This is why corruption in the north rarely leads to structural reform. At most, it leads to cosmetic changes, new compliance rules, new transparency initiatives, new committees. The underlying mechanisms remain intact, and that's because those mechanisms are not bugs, they are features. Now consider how this narrative affects democracy. If citizens believe their countries are corrupt, dysfunctional, and incapable of self-governance, they are more likely to accept external control, austerity measures, structural adjustments, policy prescriptions imposed from outside. Corruption becomes a moral excuse for domination. Meanwhile, citizens in rich countries are encouraged to believe their systems work, that influence is balanced, that institutions are neutral, that the market corrects excess. This belief is crucial, because if people in the global north truly understood how much private power shapes public policy, the legitimacy of their democracies would be questioned, and questioning legitimacy is dangerous. So corruption must remain something that happens elsewhere. Now let's return to the idea of legality. One of the most powerful shields protecting corruption in the global north is the assumption that legality equals legitimacy. If something is legal, it must be acceptable. But legality is not neutral. Laws are the outcome of political struggle. They reflect power relations. They institutionalize advantage. When corporations influence lawmakers to lower taxes, weaken regulation, or secure subsidies, the result is legal corruption. It is corruption without crime. And it is far more damaging than individual bribery because it reshapes entire systems. This type of corruption does not steal millions, it redistributes billions. Yet it remains largely invisible because it does not violate formal rules. It writes them. This is why focusing only on illegal corruption is misleading. It treats symptoms while ignoring structure. It is like condemning theft while ignoring wage theft, condemning street crime while ignoring financial crime. The scale is different. The impact is different, but the moral language is inverted. Now consider the role of corporations. Multinational companies operate across borders. They negotiate directly with governments. They influence trade agreements. They extract resources. They move profits. Their power often exceeds that of the states they deal with, especially in the global south. Yet when corruption occurs in these interactions, responsibility is rarely assigned to corporations. It is assigned to corrupt governments. This absolves the actors with the most power. If a corporation bribes an official in a poor country, the narrative focuses on the official, rarely on the system that incentivized the bribe, rarely on the country where the corporation is headquartered. The global north remains morally clean. This selective blame is essential to maintaining the current global order, because acknowledging systemic corruption in the north would require structural change. And structural change is expensive for those who benefit. If this analysis is resonating, take a moment to like the video. These ideas rarely circulate widely, and visibility matters. Now think about financial secrecy. Secrecy jurisdictions do not exist in isolation. They exist because powerful countries allow them to, protect them, use them. Money laundering is not a peripheral issue. It is a core function of the global financial system. Illicit funds flow through major banks. Shell companies are created by prestigious law firms. Assets are protected by complex legal structures. This is not the work of weak institutions, it is the work of strong ones. Yet corruption narratives continue to focus on weak states. Why? Because weak states are easier to blame, easier to discipline, easier to control. Strong states write the story. And this brings us to perhaps the most uncomfortable idea of all. The global North needs the global South to appear corrupt. It needs that contrast to justify its own dominance, to explain global inequality without addressing history, to avoid talking about colonialism, extraction, and exploitation. If poverty is caused by corruption, then wealth is earned. If underdevelopment is self-inflicted, then no one owes anything. Corruption becomes a moral alibi. But once you see corruption as systemic, global, and deeply embedded in legal structures, the alibi disappears. Inequality stops looking accidental. It starts looking designed. Once you reach this point, the question is no longer whether corruption exists in the global North. That question has already been answered. The real question is why it is not treated as corruption. And the answer is simple, though uncomfortable, because naming it would expose how the global system actually works. Corruption, in its most dangerous form, is not about envelopes of cash. It is about the normalization of influence. It is about systems that quietly transfer wealth upward while presenting themselves as neutral, technical, and inevitable. It is about laws written by those with the power to write them. When corruption is framed as something that only happens in failed or developing countries, the global hierarchy remains intact. The North appears disciplined and deserving. The South appears chaotic and responsible for its own condition. This framing protects privilege. It allows rich countries to position themselves as judges, not participants, as solutions, not contributors, as moral authorities, not beneficiaries of a deeply unequal system. And this has real consequences. Policies are imposed, sovereignty is undermined, public services are dismantled, austerity is justified, all in the name of fighting corruption. But corruption cannot be solved by targeting only its most visible forms. It cannot be solved by moralizing poverty or criminalizing weak states. And it certainly cannot be solved while ignoring the legal structures that enable the largest flows of illicit wealth on the planet. To confront corruption honestly would require confronting power. It would require questioning lobbying, questioning financial secrecy, questioning corporate influence, questioning who writes the rules of the global economy. And that is precisely why the conversation rarely goes there. Because the moment corruption is understood as systemic rather than cultural, the blame shifts. Responsibility moves upward, and that threatens the foundations of the current order. This is also why corruption narratives are so persistent. They are useful. They simplify complex histories into moral judgments. They turn structural inequality into individual failure. They allow the world to look unequal without looking unjust. If you followed this entire analysis, subscribe to the channel now. Not because you agree with everything, but because these conversations matter, and they are deliberately kept at the margins. Understanding corruption as a global system does not mean denying real problems in the global South. It means refusing to let those problems be weaponized. It means recognizing that corruption does not disappear with wealth. It evolves with it. In the global North, corruption is quieter, more legal, more abstract, but no less destructive. and perhaps more dangerous because it is harder to challenge. The fight against corruption cannot begin by pointing fingers. It must begin by questioning systems, by exposing who benefits, by refusing to confuse legality with legitimacy. Anything less is performance. If this video changed how you see corruption, leave a like and share it. Help disrupt the idea that corruption is something that only happens elsewhere, to other people, in other countries. And remember what was said from the very first line: prepare to unlearn, because seeing the world clearly often requires letting go of the stories we were taught to protect power and ourselves from uncomfortable truths.